two people walk in the door and they're like, hey, we're here. And they stayed until like 2:30 in the morning. And it was like, I love you so dearly. I want to spend eternity in heaven with you, but you gotta go home. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bible Geeks Weekly Podcast. This is episode 130. I'm Brian Shealy.
I'm Ryan Joy.
And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. We're in week 44 of our cross-training series, wrapping up this conversation that we've been having about endurance. And today we're talking about burden bearing. So if you have like a back brace and maybe some lifting boots or lifting gloves, we're going to be weightlifting.
Yeah. Well, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law just moved here, and he had his weightlifting belt on. He has a really, really bad back. My sister-in-law and I eventually talked him into letting me do most of the lifting for any of the big stuff. But I have to say, the real burden bearing came after they moved in here with us for, I don't know, a month or two. And they have watched our kids when we needed help. They've helped us talk through emotional issues, relational things, just, as sounding boards. They put up with the craziness of our family. So that, I think, is real burden bearing, like we read about in Galatians 6, verse 2, that forbearing with each other and helping support each other in crisis and helping with the workload of life. And, of course, helping restore someone when they slip into transgression. But there's been some burden bearing around here in our house, and we'll get into all kinds of burden bearing here on the podcast.
Yeah. So let's get into our first segment here on the episode. And that is Like the Teacher. Again, we're in week 44 talking about burden bearing as we wrap up this conversation on endurance. And let's go to Luke 15, verses 4 through 7, where Jesus talks about this really familiar parable of the man who has 100 sheep and loses one of them. And he asks the question here, do you not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? So the foregone conclusion here is you're going to go look for that one sheep. And then when you find the one sheep, he says he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. He picks that sheep up, carries it back home, and when he gets home, everybody rejoices together. And we should all rejoice together when somebody comes back to the Lord. So here in this story, Jesus is talking about sheep. What do you learn about burden bearing here?
I think you see the shepherd takes what you might call radical responsibility for his sheep.
Oh, yeah.
He doesn't choose what the sheep will do. He didn't make that sheep wander off. But even when the sheep did wander off, he felt the well-being of that sheep rested on his shoulders. And then at the end of the story, the sheep rests literally on his shoulders as he joyfully carries him home. And Martin Luther did a sermon where he put Isaiah 9 together with this story in Luke 15 and highlighted how willing Jesus is to carry his people. Isaiah 9 talks about how the wonderful counselor, Prince of Peace, mighty God, these names for Jesus, that the government shall be on his shoulder.
Oh, yeah.
And that's very different than a Caesar who is riding on his people's shoulders, or the description that Samuel gave to the people of what it's going to be like when you have a king and he's taxing you and breaking your back. Instead of riding on our shoulders, our king carries all of his kingdom on his shoulder. And so we are all, in a way, that sheep who is riding on him. So, and in that way, Jesus is the ultimate example of burden bearing, and he's also the one that we have to lean on if we hope to do this work of burden bearing ourselves.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with this, that this shepherd has taken such ownership of these sheep. I mean, Jesus clearly says, he has 100 sheep, so these are his sheep. And if he loses one of them, he is not going to let that fly. He's not going to leave that one sheep just to be by himself and just forget about him, because he owns the sheep. These are his sheep. And when I think about Jesus being the good shepherd, it's hard not to think about John 10 as he's talking really about himself being the good shepherd and how he lays down his life for the sheep, unlike the hired hand who really doesn't care, who's not invested. And the hired hand runs away when there's danger. And Jesus, as the good shepherd, he's the one who lays his life down. He puts his life on the line. Like we see here in this man who just leaves the 99 behind, he's invested in our problems. Mm-hmm. Jesus is radically, like you were talking about, radically responsible for us. He takes ownership of us. And when we go astray, like when we find ourselves wandering according to our own passions and the things that we want to do, the things that we get confused by or attracted by, Jesus cares about that. He doesn't just want us to go away and never think about us again. Good riddance to bad rubbish kind of situation. No, Jesus really cares. And so when one of your sheep is lost, it sends you into this all-encompassing search when you are invested in the sheep. And so, I don't know, it just kind of informs how I look at other people. Like you were kind of alluding to at the end of your discussion, how does that color the way that I view this job? And do I look at other people like I could be a help to them and that I could be a blessing to them? Is this just their problems and their issues that they need to deal with? Or do I have an ownership in that?
Yeah, well, in the verse before the burden-bearing verse there in Galatians 6 is about someone who has slipped.
Right.
It makes you think of the yellow caution sign near the place where somebody's mopped. Somebody has slipped into a transgression, and it's the job of those who are spiritual to restore them. And that's what Jesus is giving a picture of here. So it's really, I think, fitting for this burden-bearing discussion, but we have to be invested like Jesus is in order to have the concern and the willingness to go out and say, I'm gonna take some risks. I'm gonna experience some discomfort to go and see what I can do to help somebody. And people are worth the investment. Whatever it takes, go and get them.
Well, and your conversation that you started this whole thing off with about helping a friend move, for all of us who've ever been there, and when somebody asks you to help them move, sometimes my first reaction is oh man, that's going to be a lot of work, right? And I don't think the whole work of burden bearing and carrying other people's loads, spiritually speaking, is any less work or is any less taxing and involved and strenuous and just stressful. It is all that stuff. And so this is not something that's just easy that Jesus is asking us to do, which is why investment has to be a part of it. Otherwise, we're just going to throw up our hands and be like, I'm done. I quit. I can't do this anymore. I mean, unless we really care about these people, then we're probably not going to step in the way that Jesus wants us to.
Yeah, inherent in the word burden is this sense that this is going to be rough. Yeah. This is heavy for them. It's oppressive and difficult for them to carry. And why would we think this is going to be no problem? This is going to be a cinch for me to throw some of that onto my shoulder. It is going to be difficult. But if we have the ability to do that and they're carrying more than they can, well, now we've distributed the load and we can both go forward on the road together until they're capable of carrying more on their own.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, so let's get into our second segment here on the episode, and that is Deep Thoughts.
And now, Deep Thoughts by Jack Handy.
So we have some deep thoughts on burden bearing here. Probably makes sense, Ryan, if you want to kick this thing off. Talk about something that when you study God's word and you're looking at burden bearing that just stands out as being super important.
I think it's interesting. Again, we're drawing this conversation about burden bearing largely from Galatians 6, the first few verses there. Oh, yeah. And I find it really striking that Paul spends half of this discussion about burden bearing on our humility, on the humility of the person who is helping the other person. Mm-hmm. And so I think for me, both of my deep thoughts come from that emphasis, because how you see yourself is critical to your success in this. Without humility, we can fail at the task of bearing a person's burden, and we can fail at bearing our own load and lose our way and fall. And, you can get a big head from this and you can lose your way. And so my first thought is, I guess, about how we view ourselves relative to the people that we're trying to be of service to. And there is a way to lead someone that leads them to feel smaller and less significant after you help them.
Yeah.
Where how you view them is they're defined by their neediness, by their less fortunateness. And so you are just I'm here to help, but I'm here to help like the hero who's swooping in. And that's where I think Matthew 25 is so powerful, when we don't see ourselves in helping them as if we're their savior who's come, but we see ourselves as a servant and realize that each time we do for someone else, Jesus sees it as an act of service to him, our true savior. So if every time I go to someone who has a burden, someone who has been caught in a transgression, someone who maybe doesn't have what they need to get through the month financially, or has some, whatever it is, some emotional load or relationship issue that they need help with, whatever it is, and you're trying to go and support them, and you're rallying, maybe several Christians are rallying to them. We have to see them as people that Jesus sees as valuable and worthy of great respect and honor. And if we can give them service like we would give to Jesus, if we can see them as just another brother, another sister, another sinner that Jesus has saved, another person that is like us in so many ways, that they are in need of some support now, but I will also, and have often been in need of some patience, of some help, of something, and I might need them again at some point. So yeah, I just think remembering that Matthew 25 picture really elevates for me how I go and serve other people, that what you did to the least of these, you did to me.
I love the point you're bringing out there, but don't you think that's kind of why so many people don't want to ask for help, is because it feels like a lack of dignity, or it feels like a lack of you pulling your weight or doing what you're supposed to do. I mean, I know so many people who just hate to ask for help. And I know so many people like that because I am that way. Like I am that way all the time. Like I hate asking for help. And to look like I need help is something that I feel terribly about it. And then when somebody swoops in and act like they've, done me such a favor and, kind of in that attitude that we were just talking about, like that's what I'm afraid of. But I mean, when somebody comes in to help who just couldn't be nicer and couldn't be more understanding and forgiving, and they're not going to hold it over your head, that's just great. And so I love that distinction there, that we need to keep, like we're helping Jesus, in mind as we help these people. That's a great point to start this thing off with.
Yeah, let me read this passage, and then I'll hand it back to you for your next thought. Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone, and not in his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load. There's kind of a settling into this subject as you read that.
Yeah.
It's so rich and complete. So yeah, as you think about this idea of burden bearing that you see there, what deep thought comes to your mind?
I was thinking about this term that I hear all the time, like getting voluntold. Like when you volunteer for something, that's very different than when you're voluntold to do something. Like sometimes there are opportunities to help where I haven't thought of it or I haven't discovered it on my own, but it's something that I've been asked to do. And I think sometimes, for me at least, that kind of changes the calculus of how invested I am when I'm helping somebody because that's what I've been asked to do or told to do. It's kind of like your parents, and I'm sure yours did this too, but like when your parents ask, like, okay, now what do you say? When they're trying to get you to be grateful and say thank you for something, it's like, I'll say thank you, but did I really mean that? And so when I'm in the scenario where I'm actually helping somebody and laying it all out there, bearing people's burdens because it's something that I've been asked to do, I think it's a struggle to make sure that I'm doing it for the right reasons. I think about this in terms of like Acts 6 as what a lot of people would argue is like the first deacons, these 7 men who were put in place to serve the Hellenistic widows. And so there were qualifications for them to be able to serve. They were supposed to be wise, they were supposed to be filled with the Spirit, and they were supposed to have a good reputation. And so I think these qualifications are really important because if you ask these men to go do something, to do a work like this, and they weren't the kind of men who really had the right head on their shoulders and were focused on the right things, I think they probably would have been maybe dragged down by this work. And I can tell you, like, there have been times where being a deacon, even in terms of like the digital stuff that we do, and even when you were here, like, there were times where it was just like, come on, really? Like, is this what my whole Sunday morning is focused on? Is like, oh, the projector doesn't work, and that just becomes this big thing.
Sure.
And that's what everybody's talking about. And it's like, yeah, I mean, I could imagine being incredibly frustrated by that if I didn't have the right head on my shoulders and was continually remembering, like, why am I doing this? Why did I sign up for this?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you brought out there about those 7 that were chosen to serve in this really important work, that they had to be full of wisdom and full of the Spirit, because it takes something extra to really serve well. And you have to, it's the same principle, it's the same qualification that Paul gives here in Galatians 6. He doesn't say full of the Spirit. He says, you who are spiritual should restore them.
Yeah.
And it takes a certain level of spirituality and being led by God's Spirit, directed in the way that we should think about things and think about one another, and the way we should serve and the way we should think about ourselves, in order for us to be able to properly serve. So that goes really well with this second idea about humility. And the second one that I see here in this whole conversation about not thinking so much of yourself and bearing your own load is about our limits, which is a subject I've been thinking about for a while. I think I may have brought it up a couple times over the last year or so. Paul wants us to understand that we aren't all that. We can easily fall. We need to ultimately prioritize our load and not try to steal from someone else what is fundamental to their own personal responsibility, what is theirs to bear.
Right.
There is the stuff that I can take on myself from someone, and there's the stuff that I really have to leave to them. And what happens a lot of times for me is I can take on more than is good for me. We can take on more than is really good for ourselves and our family and our church, but also isn't good for the people we're serving. And, Jesus accepted people's choices. And in all the good he did, and all the healings, and all the towns, and all the preachings, there were a lot of sick people that he didn't get to.
Right.
There were a lot of souls he didn't teach while he walked through Galilee. And we won't get to everyone while we walk through this life. And I can't do everything. I've found that I needed to have ways to navigate them to their choices and to say, look, I'm here to support you. I'm going to help you however I can, but you have to make some choices here, whether sometimes it's financial or physical, but a lot of times it's spiritual, and this kind of, there is a natural, as we've talked about before, messiness to especially working with people in the world and trying to bring people to Christ and trying to help people see all that's involved in shifting their perspective about their own life and really taking ownership of walking with Christ for themselves. So just like in Jesus' life, someone could look at the enormous needs of the whole world and mischaracterize Christ's results while on earth as relatively small. We have to recognize, no, he took the steps that he could while he was here, and he made a way for anyone who chooses to come to him. But ultimately, that's going to be on each person, and we each can only do so much.
Yeah, and so my last thought here, I guess, is just kind of a quick one. I've been kind of reminding myself this week as I've been thinking about this lesson that I don't get to define what is somebody's burden. I don't get to dictate what a burden is. And, how would I feel like if I were going through some difficult moment in my life, some anxiety or stress or issue that I was having to deal with, only to have somebody bust in the door and act dismissively about what I was going through, having them say stuff like, it's not that bad, or oh, I've been through a whole lot worse than you're going through. It's I know for me, sometimes it's hard when I compare what I've gone through with what somebody else has gone through. And I just need to be really careful about not looking down on somebody, kind of like we were talking about earlier, not thinking that I'm just going to be able to handle everything, or that their problems are so small and minuscule compared to my own. I think about this like with qualifications. We were kind of just talking about qualifications a little bit, but like notice how the Bible doesn't really talk about what is or is not a burden. Like there's no list given of like, here's how you can tell what a burden is. It's like, it's just assumed that like, you know what a burden is. I know what a burden is to me, and you know what a burden is to you. And those two things are probably going to be very different depending on our maturity levels. And I am more acutely aware of this raising a 10-year-old daughter to really just settle in on the fact that I need to just be supportive and listen rather than like shutting down any kind of concerns that she has. Like she needs to know that I'm there and that I'm listening to her, and that it doesn't matter how silly some of these things are. Like, I want her to talk to me about it, and I need to be really careful not to be dismissive. I think in a lot of cases, it's just a dangerous side effect of comparison, because just because I didn't deal with a struggle like this, just because I've been successful overcoming some things like this, it doesn't make that true for other people. It doesn't mean that just because I find it easy to get over something like that, that somebody else should too. And so I don't need to look down on them, just like I wouldn't want other people to look down on me. And so maybe that's the power in confessing our trespasses to each other. It's the power in being humble with each other and meek and gentle, as we talk about there in Galatians. It's like I have the power really to be approachable, relatable to people, and support them in a way that doesn't make them feel terrible or like I'm on my high horse looking down on them, like all of your problems are so minuscule and tiny down there. It's like I can get in the trenches and make somebody feel like I'm part of the work.
Yeah, it makes me think of, sometimes people will say, well, that's my cross to bear, or that's your cross to bear.
Yeah.
Coming from Jesus' statement that if you want to follow me, you have to take up your cross. Each disciple must take up his cross and bear it and follow me. And it's everybody's cross is going to be a little bit different. You can't look down on somebody else's cross. You can't wish that your cross was like somebody else's cross. You can't, I have a different burden to bear than I did when I was 19 years old.
Oh, yeah.
It felt pretty heavy to me at the time, but it's different than it is now. There are people I know that, especially those who deal with chronic illness or just all kinds of difficulties that I've never experienced, that my burden feels pretty meager as I think about it compared to theirs.
Right.
But if I do have more room to carry something because of the burden I have, then that's great. I can take on more from somebody else. But yeah, I love the point you're making. We are not burden evaluators. That's not our job.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a good way to put it. All right. So those are a few of our deep thoughts on burden bearing. Let's get into our third segment here on the episode, and that is Through the Week.
I am ready to face any challenges that might be foolish enough to face me.
So every week we drop 5 challenges that we're going to do, and we encourage you to do them along with us. This week, of course, we are focused on burden bearing. And so this week we're going to read a few things. That's Luke 15, verses 4 through 7 that we talked about earlier, Matthew 25, verse 31 to 46, Isaiah 53, verses 1 to 13, Romans 15, verses 1 to 7, and Galatians 6, verses 1 to 10, which we've also talked about. And so I'm focused here on Romans 15 because it's such a great place to go in terms of dealing with people, especially dealing with people who've got issues and things that they need help with. And so I think Paul is reminding us to get off the island, get off of your selfish, self-focused way of living, because it is so easy to think that we are the center of our story or the center of our universe. But if you ever watched Castaway, he wanted to get off that island. He was sick of talking to a volleyball with a bloody handprint on it. He wanted to get back to dealing with people again.
Wilson!
Exactly. And so, you think about this in terms of your opportunity to help other people. And that's what brings the power to what Paul says in Romans 15, verse 1, where he says, "We who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up." So as you look to Jesus, who didn't live for his pleasure, he lived for our salvation. Am I armed with that same obligation? Am I armed with the same mission that Jesus had to help other people, to bear with their failings and to please other people for their good, building them up, not myself. And so could I expect more from others than I'm willing to give? Is there a way that I can add to somebody's life rather than tearing it down? Just a few questions that come to my mind in thinking about this. But yeah, just stop living selfishly as you start to think about what you can do to bring a blessing into the life of someone who needs you so desperately.
Well, stop living selfishly. That pretty much goes right into our reflect question, which is how invested am I in others' problems and struggles? And I think for me, a barrier sometimes to greater investment is feeling limited in how much of a difference I can make.
Mm-hmm.
You know that story about the guy, he's throwing starfish into the ocean from the beach, and he's walking, and somebody says, what are you doing? There's thousands of starfish up and down this beach, and you just spend your time walking up and down. You'll never get to them all. It'll never make a difference. And he says, as he throws one into the ocean, it made a difference to that one. He's saved a life of a little sea star. And I think learning to remember that it matters that we care, whether or not I'm able to solve a problem. It matters that we pray and we love and we try. It goes back to the shepherd story. He goes out into the dangers and the discomfort of the wilderness to find the one sheep. There was no guarantee he would find anything, or he might have found a bloody carcass of the sheep, but he risked all of it for the chance that maybe he would be able to bring this sheep back on his shoulders. And part of what I have to remember is that even if some people will get themselves into messes like you talked about that I can't save them from, or there's difficulties that I'm incapable of fully resolving to help people, there are so many things I can do. Sometimes it's small things, like the cup of cold water, the small kindly word, like in the song that we sing.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, the little things can matter, whatever I can do. And just caring matters. The way I live and who I am, that I care to be. This goes back to what we want to be reliable for, that I care to be the person who loves, like you talked about last week. How can I, like the shepherd in Jesus' story, take radical responsibility, not necessarily for everything about the lives of someone else, but for the difference I can make in a life through prayer, through influence, through relationships, through my words, through whatever difference that the Lord gives me opportunity to make.
I think that's a good distinction too. And I know we haven't really mentioned that here on the episode, but I'm sure a lot of people's lives would be made better not by us busting through the door and trying to fix everyone's problems, but by just being there, by being available, by listening.
Yeah.
I know you've talked about how you and Adrian kind of have that struggle. I also have that struggle. Like, I want to fix a problem. It's a lot harder for me just to sit there and be a good listener and do the job of being present and available rather than like trying to just resolve everything. So also a good way of kind of refocusing what kind of work we can do for others. It's not about fixing the problem. It's not even the end result of all the things that somebody's burdens might look like in their life. It's just the journey along the way that we can be a part of. I think that's always something that we can do for people.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so then let's get into our request challenge here, which is a prayer to offer to the Lord. And this week our prayer is, give me the strength and compassion to see the burdens of others and act in mercy. That's all based on Luke 10, verses 33 to 37. Of course, the story there of the Good Samaritan, who is the great example of a burden bearer, I think, in Jesus' parables. But here we see that it takes strength and it takes compassion. And that is definitely what the Good Samaritan had. He had this kind of compassion. And as I was reading the story again, I kind of started thinking about Boaz and Ruth, and like Boaz's compassion for Ruth, and how he had like carefully considered corners of his field. And he was like real intentional about the space and the margin he made to be able to serve other people. And of course, that was God's instruction to his people, was that they were supposed to leave the corners of the field for the poor and the misfortunate. And so Boaz here is a great example. When he sees Ruth and Naomi and he's able to help them, he's just so abundant in his generosity. Yeah, maybe he had the hots for Ruth, but like, I mean, he definitely was somebody who made space in his life for helping other people. And when I am just so self-centered and so wrapped up in my own issues and things that are going on in my own life, maybe I don't make enough time. Maybe I don't set aside my resources like I could to be able to support other people. And so this prayer give me strength and compassion to see the burdens of others and act. It kind of just helps me prepare for the work, like be available to it and then see it and seize the opportunity. And these are things that we can all do with our finances, our time, attention, our resources, everything that we have can really be used in serving other people like this.
Yeah, see it and act. See it and get to work. Do something about it when we can. I think that really goes with the Respond Challenge, which is to review your prayer list and find a way to aid a brother or sister. There's a show that Adrian and I used to watch called Sports Night. This guy in one episode is trying to figure out what charity he's going to donate to. And he's like auditing every single charity, and he's asking everybody, what do you do? Well, whenever I have opportunity, I give to this person, this organization, and I try to volunteer over here. And he's just mulling it over for a whole episode. And finally, this one character says to him, look, it's not about finding the perfect thing. You know what the key is? Get in the game. Do something.
Yeah.
You want to write a check? You want to volunteer? You want to do what you want to do? Just stop mulling everything over and get to work. And sometimes one of the hardest things to do is to find a place to start. Because one of two things, either sometimes we don't see the needs very clearly, like what is the need? Or other times we see all of the needs and we're overwhelmed by them. And either way, I think maybe a good place to start is, like we say in this challenge, your prayer list, or even grabbing your church bulletin. If you have one of those, look at those ongoing needs, those people that are listed over and over again each week, or somebody that's, especially new to the list for that week, and then circle a couple names, pick somebody, and then get in the game, just get to work. And I think it's great to find some fun, like we've talked about several times in the last few months. Get creative, figuring out ways to serve and to bless, and to maybe it's just making somebody's day better. We can't always heal all the problems, like we said, but we can make a difference. And like you said, just being there for people really does make a difference.
Yeah. And then that leads to our last challenge, which is a reach out challenge. And that's to ask somebody a spiritually focused question, which we're going to ask each other. Is it ever difficult for you to maintain perspective and healthy boundaries as you support others? Why or why not? I love the end of this question. Why or why not? Like, if anybody is answering you like, oh, I've got all the boundaries and perspective just lined up and locked and loaded, like maybe you should move on to talking to somebody else. So anyway, Ryan, how difficult is it for you to maintain perspective and healthy boundaries?
Well, I think it's been pretty clear from the conversation thus far that I've had my challenges in this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever, when you were a kid, go to a potluck, maybe a potluck dessert table, and you just load up so much amazing food, pie and cake and cookies and ice cream, that you can't even finish it, even though it's all you want to do is eat it? And your parents say, your eyes were bigger than your stomach.
Exactly.
And,
yeah, that's happened.
Well, so sometimes my eyes are bigger than my capacity to help. Maybe my eyes are bigger than my shoulders for burden bearing. And as Christians, if somebody needs help, you just want to jump in and get her done and just do the job, But the more that happens, the more you learn how complex helping people can be sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it has to do with even just what you do in the church. Just every time there's a job that comes up, and you and I both are this way, or have been at times, where it's like, okay, there's a job. I can do that job. I might be the best person for that job. I'm going to do it. But then as you stack all the jobs up, it's like, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't have loaded up my paper plate with every kind of exciting job that I want to do.
Yeah.
I should have thought, okay, I can only handle so much, even though it's all good. And sometimes it's the hard, wise choice to say no to a request for help, especially to people, in my experience, who come from outside the church. Not that we're always doing that. I mean, I try to say yes, but when there isn't that same foundation of values, sometimes there are some limitations that I have to place on some things, and just learning to be compassionate and invested in people while also realizing that I can serve people in a lot of different ways. And that doesn't always mean saying yes to every request. And also saying no with peace in my heart to some good works and focusing on a limited number of activities and priorities and jobs that I think really this is where I need to be. It's a hard thing to learn, and I certainly don't have it mastered. But I guess my answer is, yeah, I do kind of have a hard time sometimes maintaining perspective and healthy boundaries as I support others. How about you, Brian? Do you ever have any challenges with that? Why or why not?
Oh no, I've got it all locked down, man. It's all good. I've got a system. Let me give you my system here.
You got a spreadsheet?
I got a spreadsheet. Yep, all the hours in the day are all planned out. But no, seriously, like I have definitely had moments in my life, especially in like hospitality, and this has just came to mind because we just recently had people over to the house for the first time a couple of days ago. And oh, by the way, there was a young boy, I won't name his name, but he took a paper plate full of one of every kind of dessert. And I listened to him tell his mom, I'm going to cut them in half. And then he stopped there and she said, and then are you going to eat both halves? And he said, yeah. Anyway.
That kid is my kind of people.
He definitely is. But I've been thinking about this in terms of like hospitality, because there have been so many times where I've wanted to say to people, like, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. You know, you've opened your home to people, whether it's people who are going to stay there for an extended period of time or like people on a Friday night coming over. I mean, you started the whole thing back when you guys were living here, like first Friday, the first Friday of every month. Everybody comes over to the Joy's house. And then we kind of took up the mantle of that after you guys left. And there have been so many times where like we've been just having tons of people over and it's like the middle of the night and I'm exhausted. I want to go to bed. And it's like, I need some boundaries here. Like, yeah. I need you guys to go so I can go to sleep. There was one night actually where everybody had left. Sherilyn and I were in the back bedroom. We were getting everything ready to go. We were cleaning up and whatever. And all of a sudden, like out of nowhere, after everyone had left, two people walk in the door and they're like, hey, we're here. And they stayed until like 2:30 in the morning. And it was like, I love you so dearly. I want to spend eternity in heaven with you, but you gotta go home. Like, and I never would have said that to them, but it's just balancing like the joy of being with people. And I think especially like now with the pandemic and everything else that has happened, like people just want to take advantage of those opportunities. Like they don't want to let any of them pass by. And so they're going to use all the time that they can get. And it's like, man, it's my bedtime. And so, I'm thinking about these things every time you open up your home, every time you invest yourself in bringing people in and being a warm and safe place for people to come and congregate and talk to each other. But then you kind of balance that with like, then I need my time. And still maintaining a healthy distance is a hard thing. And I think it's probably why Peter equates these two things in 1 Peter 4, verse 9, when he says, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. Like, why did he need to put the grumbling part in there if sometimes grumbling is a part of hospitality? And so we need to watch out for that. I need to watch out for that. And I'm constantly balancing my desire to build and connect and open with my need to like pull back and recharge and regroup from time to time. And I know we've talked about this a lot, but like, it's just that challenge that I'm always trying to find that balance of like just being out there and available and helping and supporting, but then knowing when it's time to just stop doing that.
Yeah, there's that proverb in Ecclesiastes we've talked about before about if the axe is dull and its edge unsharpened, then more strength is needed, but skill will bring success.
Yep.
And I think that's a part of what you're saying. Like you want to get to work for the Lord and serve other people, but sometimes you also have to tend to the axe. I want to chop wood, but sometimes I need to go and sharpen the axe. I need to go and recharge myself. I need to make sure that my family's taken care of. I need to make sure that I have, at some point in the week, a good night's sleep where I can go and serve people and have the right kind of heart and attitude. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in just managing it, and hopefully in talking about both sides of burden bearing and bearing our own load here, we haven't sounded like we're talking out of both sides of our mouth, but rather have helped people see some of the principles that we have grabbed onto desperately to try to make sense of it and try to distinguish, because we do have guidance, I think, in God's word to distinguish what is what in navigating how to serve others and pour ourselves out while still making sure that we're taking care of what we need to take care of in ourselves and our lives. So yeah, I think it's a work of both compassion and love and commitment to others, but also a work of wisdom and skill and making sure that we're always staying right with God first.
Yeah, and I love the progression of these marks of the master that we've been talking about. You know, we started out really basic with faith and dedication and servanthood and joy. And we've sort of started working our way up to like the 200, 300, 400 level courses.
Yeah.
And like as we're kind of nearing the end of this year and this whole cross-training series, this whole concept of fruitfulness that we just got done talking about and now endurance, like these are kind of mature subjects that, you know, you really do have to grapple with and wrestle with. And there's a lot of discernment that goes in place here to really just bear people's burdens, but not go too far, make sure you're bearing your own load, and all of these things that we've been talking about. That's why I think we have been kind of trying to walk this line delicately. And that leads to our next topic, so our next mark of the master, and what's going to be the penultimate mark of the master that we're going to cover next week.
Kenny will be proud.
I know, right?
That, you worked in penultimate accurately. Yeah, next week we're going to get into leadership. So again, there is a method to the madness. And we're working towards more mature subjects and marks of the master as we go. We wouldn't expect someone who is just baptized to be really well-versed in leadership skills and leading others in Christ, but we want to develop those things always from the youngest age, develop those skills of leadership. And so, interestingly, the first place to start when you want to be a good leader is by following. And so we're going to talk about following Jesus, who was the greatest follower of God the Father, and we'll follow Jesus, and as we follow Jesus, we'll learn to lead others to him.
I'm looking forward to that one, honestly. So thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. This has been episode 130. You can find show notes for this episode in your podcast player of choice or at BibleGeeks.fm/130. You can also find this cross-training series there on our website as well. We've got a contact form there on our website if you'd like to get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. Reach out, tell us what you want to hear on upcoming episodes. Tell us what you think about the show. We'd always appreciate the feedback that you have for us, and we'd love to get in touch with you and talk to you a little bit more and get to know you. And until next week, everyone, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
Shalom.